Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from Ann Olnick, Joan Gans Cooney, the Engelson Family Foundation, Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, Carnegie Corporation of New York, May and Samuel Rudin Family Foundation, Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.
I'm Alexander Hefner, your host on The Open Mind. Palestinian by blood, American by birth, Kuwaiti by nationality, Egyptian by upbringing, Austrian by adolescence, curious by nature. That's the autobiographical Twitter profile of our guest today, Ahmed Shihab Eldin, senior correspondent for AJ+, the online destination of Al Jazeera, and former HBO vice correspondent. Shihab Eldin is also adjunct professor at the Columbia School of Journalism and co-editor of the White Cloud Press volume, Demanding Dignity, Young Voices from the Front Lines of the Arab Revolutions. On his daringly authentic Vice reports, Shihab Eldin has chronicled a heart-wrenching refugee trail from the Syrian border to Europe, embedded reporting of the crisis with intimate interviews of the dispossessed. Shihab Eldin has covered extensively the generation coming of age in the Middle East, most recently on the young Palestinians and Israelis who've grown disillusioned with ongoing violence in the West Bank. Welcome, Ahmed. It's a pleasure to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
We've had a lot of beautiful, casual conversation off camera, and I want to continue that now. What would you say is the most enduring impact for you as a reporter of the Arab Spring in covering this multitude of challenges at the intersection of press and freedom and democracy?
Well, because you bring up the word democracy, you can look at the Arab revolutions and the uprisings that happened as a potential decentralization of power. It almost felt as though not just the Arab world had the potential to be more democratized, but that there was this simultaneous democratization of media that was happening, primarily, in certain countries like Egypt and other countries, which kind of garnered the world's attention. So I think there's been a lasting effect, at least in terms of the perceptions and the possibilities in terms of challenging authority, whether that means political or even, the media establishment, and they're often connected in that part of the world. Now, of course, for me, I have been working in the US and in the West, and even though I cover that part of the world, I think for me, kind of the lasting legacy of the so-called Arab Spring, which, in of itself is a problematic term, but for me it's been, the struggles of trying to convince editors and cover stories that don't necessarily fit into that narrative that became all too familiar. Even though the Arab Spring was once a narrative of hope, it was ultimately crisis reporting. And I think, it's important to pay attention to stories primarily in that part of the world when there is a crisis. I think it's been hard and unfortunately difficult since that kind of moment, that momentous, chaotic moment where there was a lot of interest and a lot of coverage of that part of the world. Unfortunately, I feel like it's hard to convince people to cover stories that are not inherently about a crisis or violence or sectarianism, which is how we're so often accustomed to viewing that part of the world through this lens of the other, something to be feared, and something that's inherently violent.
I do want to explore the currents and the political currency of xenophobia in this country, Brexit, and the ongoing nativism that you see manifest in Europe. First, though, why is Arab Spring problematic as a construct? Obviously, the ultimate outcome in Syria and elsewhere was genocide. fair?
Arguable.
Is that a fair
Yeah, arguably,
characterization?
certain people would call it genocide. That said, genocide, I think, is usually, for your specific beliefs and, that of the other, which, there's a lot of that. So, yeah, it's about division.
But why is it in the beginning a misnomer to characterize it as an Arab Spring?
I think it's a misnomer because it's not constructive or productive. It gives you this illusion that there was this moment in history, which it may have seemed that way, but there was a gradual lead up to what happened and what unfolded long before the spring, I was working on stories for Al Jazeera back in December when everything started to unfold, and I think it just creates a false hope and false expectation. So in terms of the terminology, but also the way, for example, what has been happening in Syria now for more than 5 years has been described as a civil war, as a proxy war, and it is very much those things today. But that's, I think, the result of kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy and kind of a series of circumstances wherein there was this popular uprising, this moment of rebellion that wasn't a civil war and that wasn't as polarized as it's now become, and that didn't have as many regional players, and perhaps to a certain extent that couldn't have been avoided. But I think that's why it's important what we call these things. Very early on, a lot of people started referring to what was happening in Syria as a civil war, including Bashar al-Assad himself, talking about terrorists coming in and kind of foreign entities, this vague abstract term that a lot of Arab leaders have used, in order to try and quell and, kind of control the people, if you will. So yeah, terminology is obviously important, but it goes far beyond that.
And in terms of the post-spring or the post-emergence of rights-based movements, that might be a better way to characterize it, the hope and the promise of a rights-based society for citizens of countries in the Middle East. In the aftermath of that, you were on the ground and have been on the ground, and for all those familiar with Snapchat or other portable electronic social media with which we dabble as sort of older, outdated, obsolete millennials, your reports on Vice are basically that intimate that you feel like you're carrying it on your phone, and I suspect you'll continue to do that for Al Jazeera. What is the experience of a journalist who covered the plight, not from a New York City office building, but from the front lines? What was that experience like?
Being on the front lines is not only important, but it provides you with nuances and context, depending on how long you're there, that inform how you frame the story and what you include and what you don't include. And obviously there's a million limitations. I say that mindful at the same time that, in terms of the media landscape today and kind of the reality of business, a lot of people are closing offices and bureaus and reporters aren't there as long. And so there is this notion of parachute journalism, which to a certain extent, the work I did at Vice, fits into that category, so to speak. That said, I'm very familiar with the region. I've grown up in some of these countries. I'm intimately familiar with it. So being on the ground, I think, just allows you to be more accurate in conveying voices that otherwise may not have necessarily factored so heavily into this kind of coverage, especially from a Western perspective. And that's where I think you see this symbiotic relationship between the role of social media in terms of empowering people to tell their own stories on the ground in a region where not only is there censorship, there's self-censorship, there's fear.
You use the term parachute journalism. There's always been an ethical dilemma associated with the idea of embedding yourself and the challenges that poses. How did you find embedding yourself in this media environment? Did you have accessibility to Wi-Fi and some of the technologies that you were importing, in essence, to this population so that they could speak truth to power as well as you could on HBO, but they intermittently in the lead up to your segment could also be part of a story?
Yeah, I mean, access is really important, and I think we pride ourselves, and I think it's quite obvious at HBO and Vice, for getting to the heart of a story, getting to the characters that are really living the reality of whatever the story is that you're covering. And that's been one of the most rewarding parts of this job in particular. And as for the technology, it's already there, and I feel very fortunate to have been able to work and start working and work on my career at a time when this connectivity was happening between journalists, between citizens and their state, between politicians and journalists, between everyone who is interested in seeking social change or political change on one level, because it's definitely enhanced my reporting. And now I feel as though my entire Twitter feed, for example, is a Rolodex of sources whose work I'm familiar with now on an ongoing basis, whether I'm there or here. And so it just makes it easier once you go on the ground to really identify those voices that deserve to be heard and that can, I think, challenge people's perceptions.
When we think about freedom of the press and importing the values of American journalists into that region, it's a catch-22.
Of course.
In essence, I would present this rather simplified reality for Americans who were cautious in the wake of the Libya experience, and Egypt to some extent, but there is this pull, gravitational pull, and this sense that the result of the spring, as it emerged in Libya, Egypt, and now even Turkey with more repressive rule, is that Americans are led to believe that the strong men are instrumental in providing that firewall against terrorism.
Right.
Is there a xenophobia attached to that point of view, or is that plainly a reality?
It's a great question, because you brought up the fact that Americans believe that. But the reality, and the sad reality I would add, is that there's many people in the Arab world, for example, I just came back from Egypt, who have traded in that possibility for challenging the status quo, for not being afraid to speak out, for security, and that the only way they could have security is through a strong man like Sisi, who's now the president of Egypt, which is much more repressive, and there's been new forced disappearances, and it's something that I think is a perception and that is not necessarily a reality. So I don't think it has to be that way. I think, unfortunately, the way things played out, people had so much hope in a very little period of time, and there was this misunderstanding, perhaps, which is, I think, very natural, and I can relate to this both personally and professionally, that change might come relatively quickly in the region. And that hasn't happened. In fact, I think the situation has devolved. And I hate to be a pessimist. There are still signs of hope and lasting changes that came out of it. But all things considered, I think that also triggers then this xenophobic perception that exists largely in the West and really, sadly, very much in America. That again, Arabs and Muslims are something to be feared, something that is inherently complex and violent, and most regrettably, something that is incompatible with American or Western life and values. And it's all connected, it's that paradigm that motivates me to do the kinds of stories I am passionate about covering. This idea that Islam is monolithic, or that there's moderate Muslims and then there's extremist Muslims, as if those same realities don't exist in all faiths. And it's troubling to see that play out also in terms of how Muslims perceive themselves, because extremism exists on both sides. And so that xenophobia you were hinting at, I think, is very much largely a product of this idea that we should trade in our freedoms for our security.
And how would you capture the temperament animating the millennial refugees, most of whom probably don't speak English?
Even without the language skills, that language barrier isn't as restrictive as one might think in terms of two different people, one person from Syria, maybe one person from Texas, finding commonality. So that's something that I think also the media, whether intentionally or not, tends to overlook.
Right, I think that, of course, the perpetual clickbait is driven by conflict and bigotry more so than problem solving and healing.
And also division. I mean, this idea that these people are otherized or orientalized, and that term itself could seem like a relic from 19th century or 18th century Europe, but that's the reality of how we're living, and it's all connected to the media, for better or worse. You look at Trump and his candidacy, this idea that we're going to have some punitive national policy of discriminating and banning an entire population, whether he meant it or didn't mean it, the fact that that's been able to kind of dominate for so many weeks the media narrative around, this election and immigration, for example, or national security, I think is really troubling.
Did the absence of a vibrant fourth estate and civil liberties in these countries pre-spring, Turkey, Syria, Egypt, do you think that contributed to this failure to recognize the commonality inherent in the Israeli or the Jewish and Muslim experience as the religions that were demonized and historically have been demonized? Do you think it's an absence of literacy?
It definitely exacerbates it.
And certainly you could say the same with respect to Israeli propaganda, which
Right.
which has reached a zenith in the
Right.
Bibi administration,
Right.
Bibi Netanyahu administration.
Yeah, it's this polarization that you're seeing, even in Israel, of course, not a country that was, going through an Arab Spring, not an Arab country at all, but still a country in the region. You're seeing this polarization across the region, and it's largely a product of how things are being framed. And, for better or worse, it seems almost futile, I think, to imagine that doing the same thing over and over again is going to lead to a different response, just generally. So I think that also applies to how...
What do you mean doing the same thing over?
In terms of how the media covers stories in that region and how stories are covered also, you're talking about technology within the region in terms of the stories that they choose to tell about the region.
And
also
what about the history they
vice
choose
versa.
to tell? I mean, do you think
Right.
that the Ahmadinejad notion of the Holocaust
Right.
being a fiction reverberated in a way that had staying power in the Middle East?
Yeah, of course. I mean, he is simply tapping into a narrative that, however obscure, existed in terms of how Muslims perceived Israel. Whether that means that a lot of Muslims would have agreed with him before he said it, I think you can liken a lot of what Ahmadinejad used to say with what Trump says today. A lot of people in the media seem surprised. And I can relate to this as well. I'm not trying to, point fingers here and suggest that I understand it better. But, there was some surprise that, how is Trump's political messaging, being received? So, how are there so many supporters and people, liking his real talk, quote unquote, real talk? And, people seeming surprised that Americans would want to ban, a majority of Americans would want to ban Muslims. I think he was simply tapping into perceptions that already existed and that preceded him, and Ahmadinejad was doing the same, for better or worse. And neither politician in this case, I think, is helping the situation.
Well, in this case, American journalists are fearing the potential ramifications of a Trump presidency
Right.
When he talks about messing with the libel laws. How much did you fear, and how much do you fear in autocratic regimes reporting? Because I'm trying to see if you link.
When I'm abroad, you mean?
When you're abroad, I'm trying to understand if there is an experience you can relay that would enable advocates of free press in autocratic countries to develop a blueprint for how they build rights, and what can inform that is your own experience, and it may be different. It may be actually a more privileged experience as an American with HBO than a homebred newspaper.
You have to always assume that you are being tracked. Whether you're working for a Western media company or a local one, if you are saying things that could be construed in any way, shape, or form as criticizing those in power explicitly, inciting, a revolution, and the connection can be, however vague,
it could be one tweet away, right?
Unfortunately, as it needs to be, yeah. Or, and the proof doesn't have to be much, because there is now this equation, this equating essentially. The region's leaders are now equating challenging authority with terrorism. There are these quote-unquote counterterrorism measures. In the same way, in the United States, after 9/11, with the Patriot Act, there were a lot of concerns around civil liberties just for ordinary citizens, but also for mainstream media here. And how many programs have covered the failures in reporting with the Iraq War, and look at the consequences of that. Hundreds of thousands of people that have lost their lives, the strengthening and exacerbating of this perception that the Muslim world is at odds with the West, that there's a civilization, a clash of civilizations between Christianity and Islam, or the West and the East. Yeah, it's I don't know how to even. It's something you always have to be aware of, but I don't necessarily think that that experientially, when you're on the ground, because there are people who are locally on the ground now speaking out, whether it's a blog post, whether it's on social media, it's like a catch-22, because at the same time the laws are tougher and the governments are coming down harder and the targeted phishing operations are continuing, and lots of Western technologies being used to track people on the ground, whether Western journalists or local journalists who are again trying to report on some of the truths that the mainstream media might be missing. I think I experienced it most heavily when I would say, in Egypt, wherein even sources, just don't want to speak out, and there's a lot of kind of, again, self-censorship, which makes your job that much harder. So from a security perspective, being worried about getting taken to prison or whatnot for what you report on isn't as big of a, I think, frustration in terms of the reporting process as having sources who have compelling stories to tell be scared into silence.
What are the toolkits that you bring to your interviews, besides what I can see as a trademark empathy and sense of community that you exhibit?
You mean technologically, or do you
technologically or interpersonally? What do you find to be, for these striving citizen journalists, to be the most useful techniques to entice your source into telling the stories that you have, sometimes anonymously, sometimes publicly on Vice?
Emphasizing the importance of context and the importance of misperceptions works wonders in a lot of ways, because, again, this is a region where a lot of people on all ends of the spectrum, whether religious, political, social, feel misunderstood, feel misrepresented. For a majority of reasons. So particularly when I'm working in the Middle East, you'd be surprised how far just a very candid, direct conversation can be about expressing my own motivations and intentions behind wanting to share their story. A lot of people worry that regardless of what they say, their words will be misconstrued, again, to fit into this very reductive, narrow narrative and story, which is we are at odds. We blame the West. The West, blames Muslims for being inherently violent and all these things. And it almost, even as I'm speaking to you now, it can seem like kind of a broken record, but it's really incredible to me how there's this idea that a story in the Middle East is only a compelling story if it somehow involves ISIS, for example, or if it somehow involves terrorism, or if it somehow involves crisis. And then we keep asking the same questions. How did this happen? Why does this continue to happen? How can you ever stop this? And even though it's important to be asking those questions, both here in the US and in the West, but also maybe even more important in the region, it's also important to provide the context for constructive cultural stories, so that people don't only assume that people who live in that part of the world are, monolithic. It's the homogenization of this region that I think is underlooked in terms of how significant it plays a role in mutual understanding, in terms of, even counterterrorism, national security. And you're starting to see more and more people, I think, take risks in terms of push to cover stories that have for too long not been told. And I'm not just talking about positive, fluffy stories. This is a complex region with people with very diverse views, and you can be not only a moderate Muslim or an extremist Muslim, there's 100 other kinds of Muslim that you can be, and that do exist. So the dehumanization of this part of the world hasn't done a favor to those who are trying to tell stories from it, whether from the inside or from the out.
There doesn't seem to be an ownership from the American perspective that the terrorist incidents that we've experienced of late were inbred. These were Americans. The Boston bombing, the horrible episode in Orlando.
In which, sorry to interrupt you, but
please.
In which both cases the FBI had already been tracking those individuals who committed these murders. And the reason I want to say that is that clearly we have a system that is not foolproof and that's not working. And I think a big part of what's not working is that there's a disconnect between the real threat, not just that Muslims impose or pose to Americans and our way of life, but the real threat that terrorists pose. Because there have been countless studies done by reputable organizations that say that Muslims and religious terrorism is not the biggest threat that we face here in the U.S. or even in Europe. But there's again this perception that it very much is, and these lone wolf attackers don't get the proper attention that they deserve, even when they're already being tracked, even if they are in fact Muslim. That only goes to show, how can you interview someone 2 to 3 times and then he gets away with this crime? That means the system itself isn't working, and the system does focus far too heavily on surveilling mosques and trying to turn informants. I think it's just a sign it's ineffective.
I think that you made an astute observation. In fact, Muslim, when you referred to lone wolves, because the majority of lone wolf episodes in this country are domestic terrorism, domestic house calls at families.
Right, environmental terrorists, there are right-wing extremists. I know it seems almost hard to believe that they pose a bigger threat than Muslim terrorists statistically, but it's empirically true. How
do you assess and correct the reporting that misperceives the threat as Muslim?
Again, I think it's complicated because it's something that comes down to things as simple as terminology and how quickly we're willing to use the term terrorist, and all these appellations and how they manifest in your mind as a consumer of media. On the flip side, I think the more important thing is to not continuously portray Muslims as something to be feared, whether in media in terms of news coverage or in media in terms of entertainment and TV programming. I think there's unfortunate consistency in terms of this narrow lens that we continue to rely on.
It's a pleasure to have you here.
It's been great, thank you.
And thanks to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time for a thoughtful excursion into the world of ideas. Until then, keep an open mind. Please visit the Open Mind website at 13.org/openmind to view this program online or to access over 1,500 other interviews. And do check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Open Mind TV for updates on future programming.
Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from Anne Olnick, Joan Gans Cooney, the Engelson Family Foundation, Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, Carnegie Corporation of New York, May and Samuel Rudin Family Foundation, Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, Rosalind P. Walter Foundation. With special thanks to the Schumann Media Center for additional support, and to the corporate community, Mutual of America.